Hi and welcome everyone. My name is Tina McCorkindale. I'm the president and CEO of the Institute for Public Relations. If you're not familiar with us, we're a nonprofit foundation dedicated to fostering greater use of research in the profession. And if you haven't signed up for our research letter, you definitely should. It's free and available every week. We also have some really great studies coming out, including some research on disinformation. We just released our big disinformation report last week. Or a couple weeks ago, and then we have one also on social media managers. So stay tuned for that. So I'm very excited today to introduce our presenter, Ariel Ellis. Ariel is the gifted strategist and storyteller in demand with audiences and organizations facing intergenerational and intercultural challenges related to competence and communication. As a diversity and inclusion consultant, she has developed strategy and curriculum for clients such as AIG, Asurian, Learfield IMG College, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. She is a professor in public relations at Lipscomb University and author of The Original Millennial, a book highlighting 6 defining lessons of leadership for millennials. We are very, very excited to have her today. So thank you, Ariel, for being here. Before we begin, if you have a question, please open the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any time during the presentation, and we will moderate a Q&A at the end of the webinar. So now, without further ado, Ariel Ellis.
Thank you so much, Tina. So excited to be with all of you today and really grateful for this opportunity to share some really critical research with you that is not only timely, but also it is in proximity to everything that we are trying to grapple with at this particular moment. As Tina said, I'm Dr. Ariel Ellis. I am professor at Lipscomb University, where I teach public relations and cross-cultural communication in Nashville, Tennessee. I also serve as a consultant for various organizations across the country and even some internationally around strategic planning, intercultural competence, as well as communication in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So before we get started, I think it's important to just take a temperature check. So tell me, how are you feeling? Type in the chat. Anywhere on a scale between 1 to 5, 1 being awful, 2 being not good, 3 being okay, 4 being good, and 5 being great. How are you feeling today, mentally, emotionally, and physically? Go ahead and type that in the chat and let me know how you feel today. It's important right now to always, as I like to say, it's taking a temperature check and identifying how you feel. It's always important when you do the work of, someone said, child, I'm tired. I get it. I understand. And we have moments throughout the day, perhaps, where you can be a 1 at the end of the day when you were a 5 at the beginning of the day. At any point of the day, you could be a 2, 3, or a 4. So this environment that we're in, this new season, this new normal, which is what we've been using a lot, it can shift us at any moment. But what's also important about the work of diversity and inclusion is, and this may feel cliche, but it's very true. People don't care how much you know unless they know how much you care. So as we do the work of diversity and inclusion, particularly as public relations and communication practitioners, we really have to be able to take care of the people that we are communicating to and for, and be able to navigate those various environmental and social factors, and identify ways where we can be actively caring for the needs of others. And so, yes, Terrence posted in the chat, a friend died of cancer last night. And so, and then some of you have typed a 5, you're feeling great. So we're all coming to this space at different at phases of life. We're coming to this space at different moments of the day, at different moments of the weekend, at various levels of our careers. And so it's important that we start off a conversation where we really identify the best ways to be able to take care of one another as we talk about the very important aspects of competence. This is an example of competence, right? And we're going to define that as well today. So before we start too, I just want you to feel free to know that you, as Candace said, as Tina said, I want you to type into the chat here and feel free to feel free to send questions. There is a Q&A rather. There is a Q&A section that you can use. As you know, leadership is about behaviors, and it's really important to be able to not only understand leadership from a perspective of, guidance and direction and vision and mission, but also understanding how your behaviors affect those that you are that are following you, affect those that you are leading. How you present and exhibit certain behaviors that will be mimicked by the people who are following you, and how you set that tone. So I think it's very important to be able to know that. But as leaders, PR leaders specifically, as we are identifying the best ways to initiate any diversity inclusion efforts or programs or plans and make sure they are effective. And one way in doing that is looking at and achieving intercultural competence. Leaders with the greatest intercultural competence in their roles are going to find ways to seek out and find value in the work that they're doing. And also they're going to be seeking out ways to find value in their differences. Any leader is going to understand the role of competence and how that informs them before they make any decisions around diversity, equity, inclusion. And their competence will show them the specific things they need in order to do that. And so we're going to look at that today. Psychological safety is one of the things that is critical in that particular area. And I'm going to go down these really quickly, and then I'm going to share with you some research that I've done in my area of intercultural competence and what that actually looks like. What are some of the key things that leaders, let's start there first. Some of the key things that leaders need as they are developing competence, what is important about competence, et cetera, and how that fits into the diversity, equity, inclusion space. First of all, what's important to know is that psychological safety, whenever we are practicing diversity and inclusion, we have to know that we can't quite practice it effectively with the people that we work with or the people that we're communicating to unless there is some physiological safety. What is the physiological safety, and what does it look like? It means that people are comfortable expressing themselves, right? Think back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. People have to feel comfortable expressing themselves. They have to feel like spaces are safe for them to be able to communicate their needs or to communicate their desires, to communicate or express their identity. There has to be some psychological safety. Also, leaders must foster environments of open-mindedness. Why is that critical? Of course, individuals have to be able to share their opinions and their ideas. They have to know that things are going to be accepted and not necessarily rejected based on how that idea materializes. Leaders also have to create environments where there is active listening. People have to believe, not only just think they're going to be heard, they have to believe that they are going to be heard. And then lastly, leaders have to create an environment of transparency. They have to know and be able to trust that they will be told the truth. Now, this doesn't mean that every leader is going to involve everyone in everything and just include difference for the sake of having difference at the table, such as practicing tokenism and pigeonholing and things of that nature. It means that we are strategically and holistically paying attention to every basic need and element that exists within our workspaces, which is why, of course, if you make that connection, which is why I asked you earlier to tell me, how are you feeling, right? We started out with that basic need and looking at those basic elements, whether overtly or implicitly, particularly when we are attempting to practice diversity and inclusion. So today I'm going to share with you some of the main ingredients that are really important to intercultural competence, and how intercultural competence is one of those missing links in practicing diversity, equity, inclusion for PR and communication practitioners, why leaders need those competencies, and what kind of training and education should you be looking for your organization. Follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook if you like. Feel free to go to those platforms and share our combo today. You can jump in, as I said, and share any questions in the Q&A section and comments, and we'll do our best to get to them. And then what we'll do is try to share either a handout or some of the slides in a short form so that we can have a rich discussion afterward, and you can continue to share this content as we go along. As you go along your day and as you go throughout your careers. So I want you to think about all the times you've seen an organization get it wrong. I know you probably can recall sometimes you've seen an organization get it wrong. You may even work for an organization that has gotten it wrong from time to time. And you may say to yourself, surely they knew this was a bad move, right? Particularly as it relates to DEI. And I'll use an acronym for short, DEI, or D&I, diversity and inclusion. You have probably said one of these quotes here on the screen. You must have thought, oh my goodness, why did they do that? What were they thinking? This is what happens when there's no diversity at the table. You've said these things probably on a regular basis because we've all seen the headlines recently, even prior to recent times and prior to COVID, prior to the racial and social injustices we've seen just in the past couple of months, prior to the economic downturn that we've experienced recently. And some of these issues are internal or perpetual in nature, and they aren't even newsworthy enough for us to get for them to get to be headlines, yet they exist. And sometimes we're aware that they exist in organizations and they may not make the headlines. So whether they're widespread or whether they're incidental, we know that these issues related to organizational culture don't just happen out of nowhere. They are key indicators that intercultural competence is missing within an organization, or it's just low or lacking in certain areas. It's an indication of how critical diversity and inclusion is or should be to leaders, and most importantly, how those outcomes are going to impact stakeholders. And in the case of many of you who are communicators, what does that mean for your constituents, for your publics, for your audiences? So I want to take a look at a couple of headlines where we might be able to predict where intercultural competence may be a root problem. We, of course, as communicators, we're consistently either writing or following or tracking and paying attention to headlines. So let's look at what the media is telling us and where we can see some indications of a lack of intercultural competence. Here's one. Automated vehicles are better at detecting pedestrians with lighter skin tones, making them more likely to hit Black people. This is a result of racial biases that are often infused into our artificial intelligence systems. We used to believe that technology was unbiased, but we now understand that the competence of its makers have everything to do with its relevance and its relatability and its usefulness to multicultural audiences. The leaders behind this technology were missing an element of intercultural competence in their decision making. All right, here's another one. Healthcare practices with medications and vaccines that have had inequitable outcomes between men and women. Both genders are not offered equal quality treatment and care for the same medical complaints. Or when different manifestations of the disease are not considered based on gender, we can expect patient outcomes to suffer. These studies are built upon studies with documentation that this is an issue, and yet the disparity remains. The leaders in this industry are clearly overlooking the prioritization of intercultural competence in their approach to education, research, training, and ultimately treatment. And if we look at education, I know many of you might be parents, and some of you might be homeschooling. You might be the teacher assistant or the teacher by default right now. I know as a professor, I'm navigating my classes, and I'm navigating this semester remotely. And so as we think about our remote environment, we can look at the challenges that we're all facing as it relates to the frustration in the education sector. For many years, even beyond the abrupt stay-at-home orders, we see how the equity in education is an issue, and how access to not only resources, but now access to internet. Students on class, like going to class on Zoom in their cars because they get better internet in their car for some reason, or they have to park their car at the McDonald's or the Starbucks because they get better access there. They're not in a normal environment. So we see that distance learning, this is a headline here, I believe from the Atlantic, that said that distance learning during this particular time of COVID is not only worsening by way of equity related to race, but also class. And so we see if intercultural competence could show up in a different way, how could we improve these outcomes, but also how could we improve this experience? So we see that technology is not necessarily the great equalizer, right? It simply amplifies the inequity that already exists. So this means that there's some things that are missing here. There are some gaps when we think about issues of diversity and inclusion, and that we need to figure out how to fill those gaps. I want to make some definitions here, or share some definitions with you. I think it's important to define and frame what these words mean before we attempt to jump in and use diversity and inclusion to fix these problems that I just mentioned to you. We as leaders have to make sure that we're assessing our knowledge and stretching our understandings and strengthening our own competence. So I want to give you some examples here of what the definition, how I'm defining intercultural competence. Intercultural is just simply meaning various ways of life. As we experience those ways of life and how they merge or intersect. So for a definition today, I want us to define and frame intercultural as various ways of life. And for the word competence, I want us to frame and define that word as a level of understanding. Competence is simply just a level of understanding. What do we know, or what we know rather, that competence can be? For the most part, we know it can be elusive. So we're looking at, what do I know? And what is my level of understanding about the thing that I know? Because competence can be so hard to pin down, what you may feel is competent in one area, or you may feel competent in one area and incompetent in another area. What someone may say is competence in one aspect may be completely different in another aspect. So it's kind of hard to pin down, but we'll talk about what the research came out to be and how it's framed for PR leaders. One of the things we know for sure is that leaders must have training and education. Many leaders recognize the need to ensure that their organizations reflect the diverse communities that they serve. And many times, that's just a general expectation that leaders automatically know what to do when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And that is not true. That is no less true, rather, even in PR. There's this expectation that because we communicate to a wide variety of publics, that we are automatically we just know exactly what to do as it relates to diversity and inclusion, and we do not. Leaders must have training and education, and we're also going to look at what that could look like as well. So I want to be clear that intercultural competency, as you know, as you come to this space and learning today, of course, I want to be clear that intercultural competence isn't affirmative action or multiculturalism. It's not diversity training. It's not equal employment opportunity. It's not political correctness or anything of that nature. As these things are facets of diversity and inclusion, and they can influence our intercultural competence, this concept is a much, much broader concept that begins with a dominant culture becoming self-aware. Dominant culture meaning leaders becoming more self-aware of customs and norms and nuances and privileges than instead of being responsive or being reactive, right? And trying to figure out how to navigate those differences. So I did a study. Let's get to the meat of it. I did a study, and what I wanted to find out was what kind of intercultural competence do leaders in the public relations industry need to ensure that they were practicing diversity, equity, inclusion effectively. So I conducted a mixed methods study, including an online survey of 10 questions, distributed that to 100 or so senior leaders in communications and PR at multinational corporations. They all had about 10 to 15 years of experience in the industry or more, but generally they had the task of either designing, communicating, implementing, or influencing how diversity and inclusion looked in their organization. And so out of those 100 or so, actually 200 or so, we sent it out to, we got about 152 responses, and we ended up interviewing 12 of those individuals to get some deeper insights into what they thought about intercultural competence and how diversity and inclusion needed to show up by being informed by intercultural competence. So here's what we found. The results were very interesting, you all. 41% of the respondents had only practiced diversity and inclusion in their present role for about 5 years or less, so anywhere between 1 to 5 years. All the respondents had participated in trainings and workshops throughout their career, and those workshops have been provided by a current or former employer, and they have been exposed perhaps to trainings by consulting firms or expert trainers or organizations like IPR or PRSA or Page Society, things of that nature. And then also, over half of the respondents felt really confident about their perceived level of intercultural competence, and 82%, this was very important, 82% of those PR leaders at multinational firms who were influencing and touching and designing the DEI work at their organization, 82% said that senior leaders need training and education in order to improve their intercultural competence, which will then give them greater insights on how to handle D&I. So the results were consistent. The results were interesting, and I'm going to go into a deeper dive here about what came out as it relates to the competencies, and I guess that's what you want to hear. What are the key competencies? And these are things that you can take back to your organization. 5 competencies were ranked: intercultural communication, intercultural sensitivity, intercultural awareness, intercultural experiences, and intercultural research. The top ranking one was communication, of course. This is communication, folks, PR people. So communication was ranked at the top as the most important competency that PR leaders need to practice DEI effectively. In that 82%, the leaders said that as intercultural communication being the top competency, that verbal exchange of ideas and messages through language was critical. Listening in the context, active listening, as I said earlier, listening in the context of DEI, looking for relatable practices through verbal and nonverbal communication, such as eye contact and things of that nature, asking questions, observing behaviors, and then adapting to, based on what you heard, based on what was communicated, based on what was observed, how do you adapt your strategies and your procedures and change the environment in order to respond to what you heard. So intercultural communication and practicing that was the #1 ranked competency that senior PR leaders said is needed to do D&I effectively. Intercultural sensitivity ranked 2nd. Why was intercultural sensitivity so important? The reality is, with many of the respondents, intercultural sensitivity was critical because of empathy mainly. Empathy was the trait, if you will, that displayed the most intercultural sensitivity. And so as leaders were ranking, and intercultural sensitivity came out the most, came out in the second tier, empathy was the biggest thing that was needed. Of course, openness, I mentioned open-mindedness earlier, acceptance, being able to understand people and just accept who they were without changing or judging and things of that nature. That willingness to know and appreciate cultural differences in intercultural context. But also, you all, here was another thing that was really important, and you'll see me come into the next competency, because there were 4 that stood out. There were 5 that we ranked, but I'll tell you why the 5th one didn't track. One of the key things that tracked in intercultural sensitivity outside of acceptance was also the noticing of things, the being able to be aware and being able to notice how, once I have some empathy for people around me, once I understand what tolerance and acceptance and openness looks like I said about communication, what am I now going to do with that information? How do I modify behavior out of respect for the people that I'm leading, now that I know that there are these differences and I have empathy for who they are and their identity? It means that we modify policies and we modify procedures, we modify practices and things of that nature. Which leads me into the 3rd competency that PR leaders need in order to practice DEI effectively, and that is intercultural awareness. This was very, very close to, I mean, everything pretty much tracked here, with the acceptance of, as I said, one thing that I'm going to share with you and why that one did not track. But intercultural awareness was critical. The reason why this one was critical and ranked number 3 is that there, again, we needed to be a little bit more of an understanding of differences, my exposure to people who are different, understanding the nuances, always having that unconscious competence. What is unconscious competence? Unconscious competence is that I'm always open to receiving new information, even though I may be moving through and communicating through spaces. I've worked with these groups before. I've worked with people of different races, of different genders, backgrounds, religions, etc. And now have that exposure and I have this understanding now. Well, you always need to have that openness, and you get the intercultural awareness. But then if I'm shut off to learning less, I don't pay attention to the nuances and how it could be different than what I thought I knew, then that's going to have create an issue with your intercultural awareness. So awareness, understanding the norms, the behaviors, the nuances, the differences, but also being open to knowing that all those things can change. That's intercultural awareness. And lastly, intercultural research. I think one of the reasons why intercultural research tracked as the 4th ranked intercultural competence that PR leaders need is because, as you know, before we approach any communication activity, we have to do research. And what we've found, for the most part, is that there's a gap in how we research differences, how we interpret the data around cultural differences, how we look at patterns as it relates to multicultural purchases and behaviors and things of that nature. The competence is missing on how to find that information and then what to do with that information, right? Because a lot of times we're dealing with bias. A lot of times we're dealing with assumptions and stereotypes, and what we feel like a strategy or a tactic that once worked before, we can just try it again. And so the leaders that took the survey, they ranked intercultural research as number 4. Now, there were 5 segments that were ranked. And the 5th one that was ranked was not selected as a priority, and that was intercultural experience. Now, I don't want you to think that that experience is not important, and it is, but the responses from intercultural experience, showed up in awareness. In that experiences and awareness, if awareness is used and applied appropriately, we're kind of one and the same. So I get aware because I've had experiences, right? I increase my awareness as a result of experiences. So experiences kind of fell off the chart. But as we did the interview, we found we got a little bit deeper. The data was clear and it showed a lot of different things. So these are some of the comments here from leaders who participated in the study and how they felt this set of 4 competencies could be integrated into training and education. And perhaps what has been their personal experiences or direct concerns with the lack of training and education to improve intercultural competencies for senior PR leaders or PR leaders in general who are practicing DEI. So someone said, I try to continue to develop my skills as much as I can. I want to be an ally. I lead by example. Someone said, based on my racial background, I know I probably have a little bit more sensitivity. There's that intercultural sensitivity tracking there. I probably have a little bit more sensitivity to how we communicate in comparison to others. And then someone said, typically as a leader, as a person of color, I've had to educate my team on how much differences matter, regardless of how they show up. I've had to educate them on how much the differences matter. More feedback. All of them, for the most part, that we interviewed, of course, said that just like in the survey, we did the interview and everyone said that there needed to be more formal training. And then one of the key challenges is both on the academy side as well as the industry side, that there are some gaps with consistent education. And one person said the organization I work for provides these resources and not everybody takes advantage of them. I try to take advantage of them because of the work that I do, but not everybody in my organization is learning as much as they can. Also, we heard from someone that said leaders do need some kind of training before they even touch D&I, because if they don't get it for the most part, they're going to continue to approach things from just a compliant base of just trying to be fair across the board versus it actually being a business imperative and it living and breathing in not only the organizational culture, but living and breathing in the communications. So what are some of the solutions here? We need an industry-wide effort to adopt these 4 competencies and to support and to have education that supports these competencies. We also need evidence-based training and assessment measures for the industry. This way, we can again track and look to see, as training is done, we can assess how well we applied the things that we learned to the communications that we're developing. We need data of the outcomes. We need to be able to see, as we apply this knowledge, are our organizations, is our industry becoming more and more diverse? Are our stakeholders feeling more included and feeling more connected to our brands and organizations? And then lastly, our competence, our intercultural competence allows us to be able to develop more equitable policies and procedures that are going to trace back to training and education. So I'm giving you here, and I will put this in a handout for you, for any of you that want to develop an assessment or an audit for your organization, as you identify training and education, as you look at training and education opportunities for your organization. I want to give you a snapshot of what could look like, what an assessment or audit could look like, not only for your organization, but for your departments and things of that nature. So these are the 4 competencies: intercultural communication, intercultural sensitivity, intercultural awareness, and intercultural research. And so you can use this assessment or this audit here to kind of, identify how well are we executing the diversity, equity, inclusion in our organization? How well are we applying DEI or D&I to the work that we're doing inside of our organization? But also, are we applying this knowledge? Are we applying competency to our strategic plans? Are we applying competency to our communication strategies? And also, here's a rubric here that I've developed for you and kind of map this out. You can also use this as you identify training and education, as you go look for resources. Is the competence adequate, inadequate? Is it minimal? Is it moderate? Is it extensive? If we're not tracking, you all, as you know, we know this in our industry. We have to be able to evaluate. We have to be able to assess, and we are looking for results. So we have to have the tools to be able to do that. More questions to ask. One of the things I did not do in my survey is I did not collect data on race and gender. And so I would suspect that I should do a part two, to collect race and gender. One of the things that I noticed, however, in those who agreed to be interviewed, there were about 30 people who agreed to be interviewed. Of the folks who agreed to be interviewed, white men did represent the majority of those who, we do know that white men represent the majority of leaders in the industry, yet none of them opted in to do an interview. Now, again, I did not collect survey data on race and gender. So this is kind of just a tidbit for me. I noticed that of those who did agree to do an interview, they did not complete the interview. And we need all voices at the table. So what I would like to do is to go back and kind of recollect or resurvey or reconnect rather with individuals to not only collect race and gender, but to identify the best ways that we can have the majority of those in the industry, namely white men, opt in to do the interviews. We had white women interview, we had Black, Hispanic, Latinx, Asian professionals being interviewed, LGBT, those with disability, but we did not have any white men opt in to do the interview. And again, they represent the majority of the industry, and we need to hear from them on these kinds of things if we're going to see specific change. And then two, as I said earlier, competence can be elusive and hard to pin down. So there are some more questions to ask about this. What are next steps, you all? What I want to leave with you is this couple things. Going beyond the surface, as you know, in communication, that's something specific that we have to make sure that we do, because a lot of times we get caught up in strategies and tactics and programs and things of that nature, but we don't really go beyond the surface. So as you pursue education for your organization or for yourself, make sure that you are identifying offerings and materials that are going to go beyond the surface. Implicit bias may be a go-to. It is a great start, but it is not the end-all be-all. This cannot be a solo conversation. In order for you to develop better intercultural competence, you have to go beyond the implicit bias. Make sure that as you are seeking out trainers and educators, that they are offering more than just implicit bias. They are giving you assessments, they're tracking data for you, and allowing you an opportunity to get a deep dive into education. The next thing is committing to a series of learnings. This cannot be a one-shot deal. In order for competence to be able to be built interculturally, you can't just have a workshop, you can't just have a guest speaker, can't just have an event or watch a webinar and you're done. This one experience is not sufficient. You have to have long-term programming in order to unpack some things and to really get deep down into the problems within your organization or within your workspace. So as you seek out training and education, make sure that your organization is committed to a series of learning. This is going to yield better results. Then the next thing you want to consider is training the trainer. Please set them up for success. When you pursue training and education, train the trainer if you intend to do it in-house, which means if you have someone, and it may be you, that person may be you, if you have someone who is an advocate for DEI, if you have someone who's already received some kind of training and education inside or outside of the organization, give them the resources. This may sound like a no-brainer, but you'd be surprised how many people are expected to teach inside of their organizations, and the organization has not given them the resource to be able to teach. So if you've been asked to develop a curriculum, or there are employees in your organization who've been asked to develop a curriculum or strategic plan around diversity, equity, and inclusion, they cannot do that without any training or resources themselves. And if you believe someone in your organization has the skills and the talent to produce diversity inclusion programming, find ways to give them as many resources as possible, such as formal resources and formal trainings, so that they can be successful at it. And then lastly, when you are pursuing training and education, don't leave anyone out. Organizational culture, as you know, we're in the middle of a shift right now. So organizational culture can shift, and the DEI efforts cannot be effective if a leader themselves are not educated. Mid-level managers are usually left to do this work. Someone in the middle is often left to carry the load as it relates to DEI. And there are some functional teams like IT and finance that get left out when it comes to training. So it means that we have to not only think about, make sure that the HR team, of course, is getting it, the communications folks are getting it, but what are the other teams, and how can the communication teams help the rest of the departments or the rest of the people and functions and units within your organization to ensure that that intercultural competence is organization-wide and no one is left out. All right, folks, we're wrapping up my segment, and then I believe there's a little bit of time for maybe conversation here. If I'm not mistaken, Tina, how much time do we have? Did I use up all my time?
No, you did great. We do have some questions.
Okay.
Okay, so Dr. Ellis, multiple people want the report. Do you have a link to it, or
I don't. Do I have a link? I don't have a link to the actual report, but I actually have something that I can share with everyone who registered today, who attended today. So I can absolutely send that to you all, and then feel free to utilize not only the report, but also feel free to utilize the resources, that assessment, that rubric that's in there as well.
Okay, so I do have a question for you. So
Sure.
people, even looking at some of the comments, people were, my organization, I'm very understanding. Do you think that the better than average effect is at play here, that maybe some people think that they are more competent? And if they do think they're more competent than others, does that affect their sort of unconscious competence that you talked about before and their willingness to learn new things, right? So
Yeah.
your survey, do you think people are saying I'm better at this than other people are? Do you think that?
Yeah, I think for the most part, I do believe that based on some of the interviews, that the mark of kind of that benchmark was really industry related. And that the perception that the participants in the study, how they perceive the industry in comparison to where we think the industry is, here's where I think I am. I think that was the first thing. And then I think definitely there's some influence around, my colleagues. I have to consistently educate my colleagues or my clients or, my students, et cetera. Like I'm consistently working to educate them. And some of them said that they experienced some emotional labor with that, right? And what that felt like to consistently have to be the educator. And that's why the priority of those 4 rankings, those 4 competencies were so critical, because then they can say, what I don't have, I may be able to learn from a colleague that does have more of that, right? Or is better in that particular area than me. So first, I think to answer that question, most of, if not all of the folks who I interviewed in the study were really influenced or really compared what they felt like they knew to where they felt like the industry was. And they all were not satisfied, of course, with the industry, the diversity makeup of the industry and the overall industry wide approach to diversity and inclusion. And I think that secondary piece was, in my own workspace, I end up being the expert. So yes.
Great. Okay, so Dominique O'Rourke has 2 questions.
Sure.
The first is, Dr. Ellis, were you surprised communication was not ranked higher?
No, because of how and I don't necessarily, I say soft skills, but I don't necessarily mean soft skills. I think in comparison to like empathy, living in the intercultural sensitivity category, in comparison to awareness, I don't think, even though communication ranked, I think 82%, got 82% and ranked high, I think that was still very telling that communicators are naturally, you would think, are going to rank communication very high. So no, I think that 82% was pretty reasonable, considering that sensitivity and awareness came right behind it.
Okay, great. And the second one is, was tolerance your word in the questionnaire or theirs?
No, tolerance was my word. Yeah. And the reason that tolerance was used is in the context of the tolerance wasn't necessarily used in the survey. Tolerance is what kind of came out of the interviews. So tolerance was more not in a sense of I'm tolerating because I have to, but I'm tolerant to whatever nuances I'm experiencing. Just that level of sensitivity. I'm sensitive to things that I did not know. So there was positivity in that, but the tolerance was more coming in terms of, or in context of, like, their curiosity and the concerns for differences, the noticing the differences, being able to modify, things of that nature. That's how tolerance was framed.
Okay, great. And so a couple people asked questions about Sandra Ortega and then Hania Sharif, who participated in our Race in the PR classroom. They're both asking questions about the programs and training themselves. So Hania asked, if someone is not providing you resources to receive training for D&I education and programming, how can you encourage them? And then Sandra asked about, how do you choose a good training program? Universities, or where can you get this?
Excellent. So as you're looking for, as you're trying to, if you need to be able to make a case, I think that's what Ania is saying, right? Needing to be able to make a case for training and education. In many cases, what I advise communication or just employees to do is to be thinking specifically about outcomes, right? We are storytellers for the most part. We're storytellers. And so we need to be able to find these really unique ways to say this problem being opportunity or obstacle, right? Looking at, we've identified that there is, there's some gaps here. There's some knowledge gaps here. And then I need to be able to, as I say, we've identified some gaps in our organization. We want to be proactive in making sure that we don't have to deal with any issues or crises or problems in our organization. And as we've identified those gaps, we then need to be able to say, if we handle this by getting training and education, we then can have these results, right? So a lot of this is in being able to, sometimes you have to convince the powers that be, convince managers or leaders that we need training and education. And a lot of that comes from that interpersonal piece, looking at, these are the gaps in our organization, or these are the issues. This is where we feel like there's a knowledge gap here. As we identify, where the knowledge gap is, if we solve this knowledge gap, here's what we have to gain. Here's what we have to yield, right? And I think there's some savvy, as I said, and some storytelling and some very interpersonal, ways in which you can, connect with decision makers in order to encourage and influence them to make decisions, to bring in that kind of training and education, and taking advantage of resources like this, and then sharing back with that decision maker and saying, look at what I learned. Look at how many people was on this webinar. Here are some of the takeaways, and engaging them and sharing that with them and say, hey, another one is coming up soon. Will you join this one with me? And as a result, here's what I think we could accomplish if we pursued that. The next question, as far as it came, I think, looking for or identifying what I think one of the best ways to choose the appropriate training or education, of course, if you feel like in your organization, if you've been tagged to lead these initiatives, you get all the training and education you can, and there's a really unique way or a really unique opportunity for you to design it for your organization. And I gave you those, kind of that audit or that assessment that you could use. So based on those competencies, you can kind of create events, you can create webinars, you can create conversations around that. But if you're looking for a trainer or a consultant or educator in this space, make sure that they are doing assessments. They are giving you data with your outcomes. You're not just going to, having a Zoom call. You're not just having a conversation. There is pre-assessment. There are readings and videos and conversations that are happening before the training to engage you, right? Then there's the actual learning event or the learning experience. And then after that, there's some assessment. And in that assessment, not only are you being assessed as an individual, but your organization can then be assessed for the long term, right? As a result of, again, not just a one-shot deal, throughout a series of trainings, right? This individual or this consulting firm or whomever, they're coming in giving you pre-readings, pre-education, pre-assessment, they're offering the learning experience, and then they're coming back to you and letting you assessing what you've learned and giving you some feedback, right, as to how well you did, how well the information, you may have retained the information, what areas do you need more information, what areas do you need more exposure. I would caution choosing any organization that does not give you that kind of thorough type training and education, because if not, it's gonna, again, just feel like I went to a webinar, and not that this is a substantial, I went to a webinar and we could have supplemented, we could have just supplemented resources versus committing to a program. And that kind of structure is a commitment.
Okay, good. Yes, because I think some people do the one and done. They show up implicit bias training or unconscious bias, and then they sort of say, all right, I did it, therefore. So
yeah,
it's are important. Okay, so Elizabeth Archer asked, well, everyone in an organization has ownership of DE&I. In your study, was communications the one who was typically managing and overseeing, or was that other groups such as HR? Did you track that?
Generally, it was, no, we didn't see if it was living throughout other parts of the organization. What we found in our interviews is that that the majority of the individuals who were practicing it were practicing DEI from an external standpoint. So they were allowing, they were practicing diversity and inclusion in order to communicate more effectively to their audiences. Now, there was a portion of them who were doing kind of the more internal pieces, but we did not ask, what parts do you own? But they were very active in those pieces. We did actually, some of the senior leaders were very high ranking, vice presidents and senior leaders. So they were responsible for it all, right? And they were, were reporting or had a dotted line to the C-suite. So it varied, but we didn't track where they lived, where the work actually lived. And so that may be something that we want to look at in the future. Thank you.
Okay, so Mary Rayborn says, there seems to be an internal professional bias between practitioners and policy/upper management folks. How can the frontline culturally competent folks get a voice at the policy table?
I think right now the frontline people, I think the frontline folks should have. I think the times are creating a really good advantage for us to have everyone's ear. And those who are policy and leadership, in leadership positions. This is a great time to be able to get ears and to kind of tug at those who are decision makers. I think it's a matter of, similar to what I said earlier, I think it's a matter of being the vocal advocate. And there's some I know sometimes that can be a little discomforting based on the work environment that you're in, but I think what it does take is to being a champion, being vocal, building a good relationship with whoever the decision maker is, and being able to explain the outcomes, right? That is very important. Being able to explain, these are the gaps, these are the outcomes I believe, right? I'm on the front line, I'm culturally competent. These are the outcomes I believe we should be pursuing, and finding people to rally with you in your organization and start to create an environment where you can't be ignored, at that point.
So a couple people asked about linguistics, language, and accents.
Yeah.
How does that play a role with the intercultural competence?
Yeah, so language and linguistics and even dialect started to show up a good bit. Language was more prominent in the intercultural intercultural communication, right? Well, competent area of competency rather. That intercultural communication area is where we started to see, some of the folks that we interview talk about language and things of that nature, but not necessarily, I'm bilingual or trilingual, multilingual, etc. Not in that way, but being able to prioritize the importance of language, being able to prioritize where the variety of different types of touch points in language and how language was being used showed up in the intercultural communication space. So while the majority of the folks that we surveyed were in the US, we did see some participation from folks who were outside of the US, as well as practitioners who were leading global initiatives, right? And so for them, being able to put a priority on language was very important.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more question, then we'll summarize.
Sure.
I apologize, there's more questions that we have time for. So Judy Weber asked, do you think these findings are transferable to non-PR leaders?
Yes, I do. In fact, I think that it is transferable across, company-wide, across any industry. I think that, of course, with the ranking of intercultural communication showing up as the top competency, that's natural for communicators. I would, that would be my, my immediate inclination. But, it would be interesting to see if we did this study in a different industry. But I do think not only the assessment as well as kind of some of the takeaways can apply for any industry as it relates to us committing to a series of trainings, identifying equitable practices and policies and outcomes. All of that can apply no matter what industry you're in. So yes. I think you're muted still, Tina.
I am. So I think I muted myself. On behalf of everyone, I wanted to say thank you so very much for taking the time to speak with us today. I personally learned a lot, especially around making sure the assessment is there. And as a research organization, for us, that's so absolutely critical. So this marks the end of the webinar. We will make the playback of the webinar available shortly. And then Dr. Ellis said she would send us the documents that we will send out as well with the webinar. So
and then
please.
Also, Tina, real quickly, yeah. I would love to circle back and maybe provide some additional answers to anyone who didn't get an answer in the chat or in the Q&A. I would love to be able to circle back with IPR. And if any of we can provide maybe a rundown of some answers, that would be really great.
Yeah, that would be great if Nikki or someone on the IPR team can quickly snapshot those, and then we can send them to you as a follow-up for those questions that weren't answered. But yes, so Dr. Ellis will send out all that stuff to you. And thank you so much for taking the time to do that. So please visit our website at instituteforpr.org for the latest research. We depend on you to help sponsor these webinars. And thank you again, Dr. Ellis, for everything. We greatly appreciate it. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day. So thank you.
Bye-bye.